A racist police officer files a lawsuit against a black woman, accusing her of harassment, but he has no idea she's a federal prosecutor with the power to expose his every misdeed. The courtroom becomes a battleground, the stakes skyrocket, and the truth threatens to bring everything crashing down. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you, or seen someone judged unfairly because of their identity? How did it feel to watch that unfold? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to share where you're watching from. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring and thought-provoking stories like this one. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Danielle Carter as she slowly rose from her seat. She adjusted her blazer, her composure unshaken despite the weight of the moment. Turning her gaze to the judge, she spoke with deliberate precision. "Your Honor," Danielle began, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Before this trial proceeds, there is something I need to disclose." Greg Larson, seated smugly at the plaintiff's table, leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk playing on his lips. To him, Danielle was just another defendant caught in the system. Easy prey. The judge raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. "Go on, Ms. Carter." Danielle allowed a pause, her eyes locking onto Larson's. "I am Danielle Carter, a federal prosecutor for the Department of Justice." The words detonated like a bomb. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Larson's confident demeanor shattered as the color drained from his face. His attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this revelation. Danielle's lips curved into a faint smile, but her voice remained steady. "It seems Mr. Larson filed this lawsuit without knowing who he was dealing with. But I assure you, that fact is about to become very relevant." Larson squirmed, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The judge adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "Noted, Miss Carter. Let us proceed." As Danielle sat back down, the courtroom buzzed with whispers, but her mind had already traveled to the night 3 months prior. The night everything changed. It was a sweltering summer evening in downtown Chicago. Danielle, dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, had just finished dinner with friends. The laughter and conversation still lingered in her mind as she approached her car parked along a dimly lit street. She had barely unlocked the door when the blaring siren of a patrol car made her freeze. The cruiser screeched to a halt behind her Tesla, and 2 officers emerged. "Hey, you!" a sharp, commanding voice barked. Danielle turned slowly, keeping her hands visible. "Is there a problem, officer?" Greg Larson, his hand resting on the grip of his holstered firearm, strode toward her with a swagger of authority. His eyes scanned her up and down, his expression hard and accusatory. "We've had reports of a black woman breaking into cars in this area," Larson said, his tone dripping with judgment. "You match the description." Danielle raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but firm. "This is my car. I can show you my ID and registration." Larson ignored her, his gaze narrowing. "Hands on the car. Now." Danielle hesitated for a brief moment but complied, placing her palms flat against the hood of her vehicle. Larson moved in closer, roughly patting her down. The other officer, a younger man who looked uneasy, stood a few feet away, watching but saying nothing. "Careful, officer," Danielle said evenly, her frustration barely contained. "You're crossing a line," Larson smirked, pulling her wallet from her pocket without permission. He flipped it open and saw her federal ID. For a moment, something akin to recognition flickered in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with indifference. "You're clean," he muttered, tossing the wallet back onto the hood of her car. But instead of apologizing, he pulled a citation pad from his pocket and began scribbling. Danielle's jaw tightened. "A citation? For what?" "Loitering," Larson replied curtly, tearing the ticket from the pad and shoving it toward her. "Consider this a warning. Don't hang around here too long." Danielle took the citation without a word, glancing at his badge. "Officer G. Larson," she murmured to herself, committing the name to memory. As Larson turned to leave, the younger officer hesitated, as if he wanted to intervene but thought better of it. Danielle locked eyes with him for a brief moment, silently conveying the gravity of what had just happened. Before she could get into her car, a bystander across the street raised their phone, clearly recording the scene. "What's going on here?" the man called out. Larson's head snapped toward the voice. "Put the phone away!" he barked, striding toward the man. "Unless you want to spend the night in a cell." The bystander reluctantly lowered his phone, glancing apologetically at Danielle before walking away. Danielle finally slid into her car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her breath came in short bursts, anger and disbelief coursing through her. As she drove off, Larson's smirk lingered in her rearview mirror like a ghost. She didn't know it then, but that encounter was a spark. A fire had ignited within her. A determination to dismantle not only Larson's sense of impunity, but the entire system that allowed people like him to thrive. Back in the courtroom, Danielle's focus returned to the present as the judge's gavel banged. The trial was officially underway. From across the room, Larson glared at her, his smugness replaced with visible unease. His attorney leaned over, whispering furiously, but Larson brushed him off, his eyes locked on Danielle. She met his gaze head-on, her expression unwavering. "This isn't just about me," she thought. "This is about every person you've ever tried to silence. And I won't stop until justice is served." 2 weeks after the traffic stop, Danielle received a thick envelope from the courthouse. As she tore it open, the words on the legal summons struck her like a blow. Plaintiff, Officer Greg Larson. Defendant, Danielle Carter. Charges, defamation, harassment. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. Larson was suing her, claiming that she had intimidated and threatened him during their encounter. It was a brazen lie, and Danielle could see through his strategy immediately. Flip the script, paint himself as the victim, and discredit her before she could act. Danielle dropped the papers on her desk and leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. Her assistant, Julia, knocked softly before stepping in. "You okay?" "Larson just sued me," Danielle said flatly, tossing the summons across the desk. Julia skimmed the document, her eyes widening. "For harassment? He's trying to cover his tracks." Danielle nodded. "And he's not stopping there. I've been hearing things. Rumors spreading in certain circles." Julia frowned. "What kind of rumors?" Danielle grabbed her phone and opened a police forum she'd been monitoring. The posts were damning. "Carter's abusing her power to make trouble for a good officer. Typical move. Play the race card when things don't go her way. She's trying to bring down Larson for doing his job." Julia shook her head in disbelief. "He's rallying them against you. This isn't just about the lawsuit anymore. He's building a narrative, and it's working," Danielle said grimly. "I've noticed the shift at work. People are keeping their distance. Some won't even look me in the eye." Danielle's reputation, meticulously built over years of hard work, was now under siege. Even some of her colleagues whispered doubts. Was she really using her position to settle a personal score? Determined not to let Larson control the narrative, Danielle began reviewing the body cam footage from the night of the stop. It was her strongest piece of evidence, a clear record of Larson's actions and words. But when she attempted to access the files through official channels, she hit a wall. "Access denied?" Danielle muttered, staring at the error message on her screen. She called Julia into her office. "They're blocking me," Danielle said, pointing to the monitor. "Someone's tampering with the system." Julia's face hardened. "This isn't an accident. Someone higher up doesn't want you to get that footage. Then I'll get it another way," Danielle said, her jaw tightening. "Call Emily. We're going to court to demand those files." At the next court hearing, Danielle's attorney, Emily Turner, stood before the judge. "Your Honor, the defense is requesting immediate access to the plaintiff's body cam footage from the night in question. It's a critical piece of evidence." Larson's attorney, a sharp-tongued litigator named Charles Reed, shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. That footage is irrelevant to the claims of defamation and harassment." Emily turned to him, her voice razor-sharp. "Irrelevant? That footage shows exactly what transpired between my client and Officer Larson. The jury has a right to see it." The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. "Motion granted. The footage will be made available to the defense." Reed's face darkened, but he said nothing. Larson, seated beside him, clenched his jaw. Despite the judge's order, delays mounted. Danielle's team faced excuse after excuse, missing files, technical errors, misplaced documents. Frustration simmered as valuable time slipped away. One evening, Julia called Danielle with news. "I've been digging through old case records tied to Larson. You're not going to believe this." "Tell me," Danielle said. "There's a pattern," Julia explained. "Similar lawsuits, claims of harassment, defamation, even intimidation, filed by Larson against people who've challenged him. Most of them are Black or Latino." Danielle felt her stomach churn. "How many?" "At least 5 in the last 3 years," Julia replied. "And here's the kicker. Almost all of those cases were quietly dropped or settled out of court." Danielle's grip on her phone tightened. "He's done this before. It's a playbook." "Exactly," Julia said. "And it's not just about protecting himself. It's about silencing anyone who might expose him." On social media, the storm raged on. Danielle became a lightning rod for controversy, with hashtags like Justice for Larson trending alongside Stand with Carter. Comment sections were battlegrounds, filled with venom and support in equal measure. Danielle scrolled through one particularly hostile thread, her heart sinking. She wasn't naive. She knew the fight for justice came with enemies, but the sheer vitriol was staggering. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, a new wave of determination washed over her. Larson's tactics were designed to intimidate, to exhaust her into submission. But Danielle wasn't backing down. The next day, Emily stormed into Danielle's office with a flash drive in hand. "We finally got it," she said, a triumphant glint in her eye. Danielle plugged the drive into her laptop, and the grainy footage from Larson's body cam flickered to life. The scene played out exactly as she remembered. Larson's aggressive demeanor, the unnecessary pat-down, the thinly veiled hostility in his voice. But as the recording continued, something new caught Danielle's attention. "Put the phone away or you'll regret it," Larson barked at the bystander filming the incident. Danielle paused the video and looked at Emily. "Did you hear that?" Emily nodded, her lips curving into a grin. "Threatening a civilian for filming him. That's abuse of power, plain and simple. And it's exactly what we need," Danielle said. Armed with the footage and Julia's research, Danielle and Emily prepared for the next stage of the trial. They knew Larson and his team would fight tooth and nail to dismiss the evidence, but they had the truth on their side. "This isn't just about me," Danielle said to Emily as they reviewed their case. "It's about every person he's ever tried to silence. If we don't stop him now, he'll keep doing this to others." Emily nodded. "Then let's make sure he doesn't get the chance." As Danielle pieced together the larger picture, it became clear that Larson wasn't acting alone. There were others protecting him, hiding behind the same corrupt system. This fight wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about tearing down the entire structure, enabling men like Larson to thrive. The trial opened with Larson exuding confidence. Seated at the plaintiff's table, he straightened his tie, occasionally glancing at the jury with a self-assured smirk. His attorney, Charles Reed, paced in front of the bench, setting a tone of quiet dominance. Emily Turner, Danielle's lawyer, stood opposite him, her demeanor calm but sharp. Danielle sat beside her, composed and unyielding, her gaze fixed on Larson. Reed began with his opening statement, his words carefully calculated to plant seeds of doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice smooth, "this case is not about justice. It's about a defendant abusing her position of power to intimidate an officer doing his duty. Officer Larson, a dedicated public servant, has been unfairly targeted by someone more interested in headlines than the truth." Danielle's jaw tightened, but she remained silent. Emily, however, leaned toward her. "He's laying it on thick," she whispered. As Reed finished, Emily rose to her feet. Her tone was measured, but her words cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. "This case," she began, "is about accountability. It's about an officer who crossed the line and thought he could weaponize the system to cover his tracks. But the truth doesn't bend to manipulation. It's clear, and it's damning," Reed scoffed loudly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is making inflammatory remarks." The judge nodded slightly. "Sustained. Stick to the facts, Mrs. Turner." Emily's expression didn't falter. "I intend to, Your Honor." The trial's first few hours were a tense back and forth. Reed hammered on the narrative that Danielle had used her position as a federal prosecutor to intimidate Larson, accusing her of veiled threats and abuse of power. "Ms. Carter," Reed said during cross-examination, "would you agree that your role grants you significant influence over legal proceedings?" Danielle met his gaze evenly. "Yes, it does." "And wouldn't you say that influence could be intimidating to someone in Officer Larson's position?" "It could," Danielle replied. "But not when that person is fabricating claims to avoid accountability." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reed's jaw clenched, but he pressed on. "So you deny using your position to pressure Officer Larson after your encounter?" "Absolutely," Danielle said firmly. "The only thing I've done is seek the truth." Reed smirked, as if expecting her answer. "The jury will decide whether that's true or not." As the trial continued, Reed began targeting Danielle personally. "This isn't the first time we've seen tactics like these," he said during a recess loud enough for the jury to hear. "When people want attention, they stir up controversy." Emily was quick to object. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's remarks are inappropriate and prejudicial." The judge glanced at Reed but said nothing. It was clear she was hesitant to reprimand him, a subtle yet noticeable bias that didn't escape Danielle's attention. "Let it go," Danielle murmured to Emily. "We'll make our case in the evidence." The turning point came when Emily introduced the body cam footage into evidence. Reed immediately objected. "Your Honor," he said, rising to his feet, "this video is irrelevant to the charges of defamation and harassment. It's an attempt to distract the jury from the real issue." Emily countered without hesitation. "The video shows the interaction that Officer Larson is basing his claims on. It's critical to establish what actually happened that night." The judge considered for a moment, then nodded. "Overruled. The video will be shown." As the courtroom lights dimmed, all eyes turned to the screen. The footage began with Larson's patrol car pulling up behind Danielle's Tesla. His voice was sharp and commanding as he barked orders at her, his demeanor aggressive from the start. The video captured the moment he forced her to place her hands on the hood of the car and patted her down roughly. Then came the bombshell. "Another one of you people thinking you're above the law." Larson's voice sneered on the recording. Gasps filled the courtroom. Danielle remained calm, her face unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. Reed jumped to his feet. "Objection! That statement is taken out of context." Emily cut him off. "Out of context?" It's his exact words. "The video speaks for itself." The judge silenced the commotion with her gavel. "Overruled. Let the jury evaluate the evidence." The video ended, and the courtroom was momentarily silent, the weight of Larson's words hanging in the air. Reed attempted to recover, questioning the relevance of the footage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said during a break, addressing the jury directly, "a single statement doesn't define a person's intentions. Let's not jump to conclusions." But Larson's behavior in the video had already left an impression. Members of the jury exchanged glances, their skepticism of his claims evident. Emily seized the moment. "Officer Larson's own words and actions undermine his credibility," she said in her next argument. "This isn't just about what he said. It's about how he abused his authority and then tried to cover it up with a fabricated lawsuit." As the trial progressed, Larson's confidence began to crack. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, occasionally glaring at Danielle, who met his gaze with unflinching resolve. During a recess, he confronted Reed in the hallway. "You need to get that video thrown out," Larson hissed. Reed scowled. "It's too late for that. And frankly, you didn't warn me about how bad this would look." Larson clenched his fists. "I didn't think she'd fight back like this." Reed shook his head, muttering under his breath as he walked away. By the end of the day, the courtroom's energy had shifted. Danielle could feel it. The jury was beginning to question Larson's integrity, but she knew the video alone wasn't enough. As Emily packed up their materials, she turned to Danielle. "We've got momentum now, but we need more. If we can show a pattern of behavior, this case is ours." Danielle nodded. "Then let's dig deeper. There's more to this story, and we're going to uncover it." The courtroom was tense as Emily Turner stood before the jury, a stack of documents in her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "what you're about to hear will reveal a pattern of behavior that speaks volumes about Officer Larson's character." Reed immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an attempt to defame my client." The judge raised a hand to silence him. "Ms. Turner, keep your argument relevant to the case." Emily nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. These are official records, all tied directly to Officer Larson's actions over the years." She turned back to the jury. "In 2019, a young man named Andre Williams, a college student with no criminal record, was arrested by Officer Larson. The charge? Resisting arrest. The reality? Andre Williams was sitting in his car outside his dormitory when Larson claimed he looked suspicious." Emily displayed a photo of Andre on the courtroom screen, showing him as a bright-eyed student with a scholarship and a promising future. Andre complied with every instruction. Yet Larson escalated the situation, dragged him out of his car, and charged him. Reed interrupted. "Andre Williams isn't relevant to this case." Emily turned sharply. "It's relevant because it shows Officer Larson's pattern of targeting young black men without cause. This isn't an isolated incident." The judge allowed her to continue, and Emily pressed forward. "Because of Larson's fabricated report, Andre lost his scholarship and his place at the university. His life was derailed." The jury's expressions shifted. Doubt clouded their faces, some leaning forward as if to grasp every detail. When Emily called Andre Williams to the stand, the room grew quieter. Andre, now in his mid-20s, stepped forward with a cautious demeanor but steady resolve. He raised his right hand, swearing to tell the truth, before taking his seat. Emily wasted no time. Andre, can you describe your encounter with Officer Larson? Andre cleared his throat, his voice measured. I was sitting in my car, about to head to work. Officer Larson pulled up, asked for my license, and said I matched the description of someone they were looking for. And how did you respond? I gave him my license, Andre said. I told him I wasn't involved in anything. But he told me to step out of the car. When I asked why, he yanked me out and pushed me against the hood. Emily's tone sharpened. Did you resist? Andre shook his head. No, I was scared. I kept my hands up, but he still said I was resisting and called for backup. How did that arrest affect your life? Emily pressed. Andre's jaw tightened. I lost my scholarship. I had to drop out of school. I couldn't get another job because of the charges on my record. It took me years to clear my name, but by then, the damage was done. Emily paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. And did Officer Larson ever explain his actions or apologize? Andre scoffed bitterly. No, he didn't care. To him, I was just another statistic. Reed stood for cross-examination, his tone clipped. Mr. Williams, isn't it true that resisting arrest was a charge brought by multiple officers, not just Officer Larson? Andre didn't flinch. Larson started it. The others just followed his lead. Reed tried again. You're saying Officer Larson had a personal vendetta against you? A stranger he had never met? Andre's voice rose slightly. I'm saying he made up a story because he could, and no one questioned him because he wore a badge. Larson, seated at the plaintiff's table, began shifting uncomfortably. His fingers drummed against the table, his jaw clenched. Reed ended his cross-examination, but the damage was done. During the recess, Larson stormed into the hallway, ignoring Reed's attempts to calm him. Danielle, walking past with Emily, caught a glimpse of him glaring at Andre, who was speaking with a reporter. That kid's lying, Larson spat under his breath. Danielle stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. Andre has nothing to gain by lying, Larson. You, on the other hand, have everything to lose. Larson's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, Carter. You think you're untouchable, but you're not. Emily stepped between them. Back off, Larson. Or do you want to add witness intimidation to your list of bad decisions? Larson muttered something under his breath before storming off. Danielle's eyes followed him, a flicker of concern crossing her face. That night, Andre called Danielle. Hey, Ms. Carter, I think Larson's been outside my building. Danielle sat up straight. What do you mean? There's been a car parked across the street all evening. I went out to get groceries, and I swear I saw him sitting in the driver's seat. When I came back, the car was gone. Danielle's mind raced. Andre, listen to me carefully. Stay inside. Don't go anywhere alone. I'm calling the police to request protection for you and your family. Do you think he'll do something? Andre asked, his voice tinged with fear. Larson's desperate, Danielle said. Desperate people do stupid things, but we won't let him intimidate you. The following morning, Danielle filed a formal request for police protection for Andre and his family, citing Larson's behavior as a potential threat. She also informed Carter, the FBI agent assisting with her case. Larson's pushing boundaries, Carter said after hearing the situation. If he's stalking witnesses, it's more than desperation. He's trying to silence them. We can't let him get away with it, Danielle said. Andre's testimony is too important. When the trial resumed, Larson's composure was visibly fraying. His usual arrogance was replaced by a simmering frustration, his glances toward the jury laced with unease. Emily seized the opportunity. Ladies and gentlemen, she said during her next presentation, what you've seen today isn't just a single incident. It's a pattern of abuse. Officer Larson has targeted individuals like Andre Williams repeatedly, using his badge to shield himself from accountability. But today, that shield is breaking. Larson slammed his hand on the table, drawing the room's attention. This is a witch hunt, he shouted. The judge's gavel came down sharply. Officer Larson, control yourself, or I'll hold you in contempt. Reed placed a hand on Larson's shoulder, hissing something in his ear. Larson reluctantly sat back, his face flushed with anger. Larson's outburst confirmed what Danielle already suspected. He was unraveling. But his desperation made him dangerous. and Danielle knew they had to tread carefully as they moved closer to exposing the full extent of his wrongdoing. "Call Officer Anthony Delgado to the stand," Larson's attorney announced, his voice echoing through the courtroom. Delgado, Larson's longtime partner, adjusted his tie as he made his way to the witness stand, his expression carefully neutral. Emily Turner leaned toward Danielle and murmured, "Watch closely. Delgado knows more than he's letting on." Danielle nodded, her eyes locked on the man now taking his oath. Reed began with a series of softball questions, his tone deliberately friendly. "Officer Delgado, how long have you worked alongside Officer Larson?" "5 years," Delgado replied. "And in that time, would you say he's been a reliable and professional officer?" "Absolutely," Delgado said without hesitation. Reed smiled. "Can you tell the court about the night Officer Larson encountered Ms. Carter? Were you present?" "Yes, I was," Delgado answered, his tone steady. "And what did you observe?" Delgado paused for effect. "Ms. Carter was uncooperative. She questioned Officer Larson repeatedly and refused to follow his instructions." "Refused?" Reed pressed, feigning surprise. "Yes," Delgado confirmed. "She became confrontational, which escalated the situation." Reed turned to the jury. "Thank you, Officer Delgado. No further questions." Emily stood and approached the stand, her movements purposeful. "Officer Delgado, you mentioned that Mrs. Carter was uncooperative. Can you specify how she refused to comply?" Delgado shifted slightly in his seat. "She kept asking why she was being stopped." Emily tilted her head. "And that's uncooperative behavior?" "It was her tone," Delgado added quickly. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Her tone? Was she shouting? Threatening you or Officer Larson?" "No," Delgado admitted. "But she was challenging our authority." Emily's voice sharpened. "Challenging your authority. Or questioning why she, a black woman parked legally in her own car, was being treated like a suspect." Delgado stiffened. "She matched the description of a suspect we were looking for." Emily seized the moment. "And did you later confirm that Missy Carter had no connection to that alleged suspect?" "Yes," Delgado said reluctantly. "So she was innocent," Emily said, her voice rising. "And yet, she was subjected to a citation and a physical search." "Tell me, Officer Delgado, was this standard procedure?" Delgado hesitated. "It depends on the situation." Emily's tone turned icy. "And in this situation, it appears the decision to escalate came entirely from Officer Larson. Is that correct?" Delgado's silence spoke volumes. Emily's cross-examination intensified. "Officer Delgado, have you ever seen Officer Larson use unnecessary force or act unprofessionally during your time working together?" "No," Delgado replied quickly. Emily held up a document. "Then how do you explain the multiple complaints filed against him over the years? Complaints that you were copied on as his partner?" Reed jumped to his feet. "Objection! Irrelevant!" Emily didn't miss a beat. "It speaks directly to the credibility of this witness and the plaintiff, Your Honor." The judge considered briefly. "Overruled. Proceed." Emily walked closer to Delgado. "I'll ask again. Are you saying you never witnessed Officer Larson act improperly, despite the numerous complaints filed against him?" Delgado's jaw tightened. "I can't speak to those complaints. But you were aware of them," Emily pressed. "Yes," Delgado admitted, his voice barely audible. "Thank you, Officer Delgado," Emily said, her tone firm. "No further questions." During the recess, Danielle stepped into the hallway, only to overhear a heated argument nearby. She rounded the corner and saw Larson, his face flushed with anger, standing toe-to-toe with Delgado. "You're hanging me out to dry," Larson hissed, jabbing a finger into Delgado's chest. Delgado raised his hands defensively. "I said what I had to say. I'm not going to perjure myself for you." Larson's voice dropped to a menacing growl. "You think they won't come after you next? You're just as involved as I am." Delgado shook his head. "This is your mess, Greg. You pushed too far." Before Larson could respond, Danielle stepped into view. "Am I interrupting something?" Both men froze, their tension palpable. Larson glared at her. "Stay out of this, Carter." Danielle crossed her arms. "Hard to do when it's my case you're trying to win by intimidation." Larson stormed off without another word, leaving Delgado standing there, visibly shaken. Back in the courtroom, Emily shifted gears, presenting a new piece of evidence, a series of emails between Larson and Delgado. These communications, Emily explained to the jury, show that Officer Larson often instructed his team to escalate minor situations, targeting individuals based on race or socioeconomic status. Reed objected again, his voice strained. Your Honor, this is an attempt to paint my client as a villain without direct relevance to the case. The judge leaned forward. If these emails demonstrate a pattern of behavior consistent with the defendant's claims, I will allow it. Overruled. Emily displayed one email on the courtroom screen. In it, Larson had written to Delgado, another one of these troublemakers. Let's make an example out of him. The jury's reaction was immediate. Shocked glances, murmurs, and a noticeable shift in their demeanor. Officer Delgado, Emily said, turning back to the witness stand. Did you ever report or question these directives from Officer Larson? Delgado looked down, his voice a near whisper. No. And why not? Emily demanded. Delgado hesitated, then admitted. Because I didn't think it would make a difference. Larson had connections. Complaints against him never went anywhere. By the end of Delgado's testimony, Larson's confidence was visibly eroding. His fists clenched on the table, and his glares toward Delgado were venomous. As the day ended, Danielle and Emily regrouped in a private room. He's losing control, Emily said, her tone sharp. Delgado cracked under pressure, and the jury knows it. Danielle nodded. Larson's desperate. We need to be ready for whatever he tries next. Larson's unraveling during Delgado's testimony was a turning point. But Danielle understood that desperation could make him more dangerous. Danielle was reviewing her notes in her office late one evening when her phone buzzed. The name on the screen read, James Carter. She answered immediately, her tone sharp. Tell me you've got something. More than something, Carter replied, his voice grim. We've been digging into Larson's connections. It's bigger than we thought. Danielle sat up, her focus intensifying. How big? Larson's part of a network, Carter said. There's a group of officers across multiple precincts, high-ranking, well-connected. They've been protecting each other for years. Complaints disappear. Evidence gets buried. And it's not just about misconduct. It's systematic corruption. Danielle's grip on the phone tightened. Do we have names? We're piecing them together. But Larson's not the mastermind. He's just a pawn, Carter explained. The real power is higher up. We believe there's someone orchestrating this, a benefactor pulling the strings. Danielle's jaw clenched. And Larson knows who it is. Exactly, Carter confirmed. He's desperate, but if we push too hard, he might shut down, or worse, lash out. Later that night, Danielle was walking to her car in the courthouse parking lot when she stopped short. Her tires were slashed, the glass of her rear window shattered. The message was clear, but the implications were chilling. She scanned the area, her instincts on high alert. Her phone vibrated in her hand, and she looked down to see a text from an unknown number. Don't dig too deep if you value your safety. Danielle inhaled deeply, forcing herself to stay calm. Instead of retreating, she snapped photos of the damage and forwarded them to Carter. Her message was curt. They're trying to intimidate me. It won't work. His response was immediate. We'll tighten security around you. Stay vigilant. Meanwhile, Larson was unraveling. Back at his precinct, he stormed into the locker room, slamming his fist against a row of metal lockers. Several officers glanced his way but said nothing. Don't just stand there, Larson snapped, his voice taut with frustration. You all know what's happening. Carter's trying to take us down, and you're letting her. One officer, a veteran named Miller, stepped forward cautiously. Greg, maybe it's time to let this go. The more you fight, the more you're dragging us into this mess. Larson's eyes narrowed. Let it go. You think she's going to stop at me? She's coming for all of us. Miller hesitated, then glanced around the room. Not everyone here is willing to stick their necks out for you, Larson. You need to face reality. Larson's face twisted with anger. Cowards. All of you. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, Danielle met with Carter and Emily in a secure conference room. Carter laid out a series of files and diagrams on the table. This, Carter began, pointing to a chart, is the web we've uncovered. Larson is connected to at least 5 other officers across 3 precincts. Each of them has a history of complaints that mysteriously disappeared. Emily scanned the chart, her expression darkening. And the benefactor? Carter shook his head. Still working on it. Whoever they are, they're careful. They use intermediaries to keep their hands clean. Danielle leaned forward. Larson is our best shot at getting a name. But he's feeling the pressure. He might break if we push him hard enough. Carter nodded. Agreed. But we need to act fast. Whoever sent that message to you knows we're getting close. They won't just sit back and watch. That afternoon, Danielle confronted Larson directly in the courthouse hallway. He was leaning against a wall, scrolling on his phone, but straightened as soon as he saw her approach. You're looking rough, Larson, Danielle said, her tone sharp. Having trouble sleeping? He glared at her. What do you want, Carter? Danielle stepped closer, her voice low but firm. I want the truth. I know you're part of something bigger, and it's crumbling around you. How long do you think they'll protect you when you're the weak link? Larson's jaw tightened. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I think I do, Danielle shot back. The threats, the intimidation tactics, the allies abandoning you one by one. It's all falling apart. If you don't start talking, you'll be the one left holding the bag. Larson's hands balled into fists, but he said nothing. Danielle smirked. Think about it, Greg. When they cut you loose, and they will, who's going to be left to save you? She turned and walked away, leaving Larson stewing in silence. That night, Carter called Danielle with an update. We've identified more connections in the network. These people have their fingerprints on everything from falsified evidence to hush money payouts. Any movement on the benefactor? Danielle asked. Not yet, Carter admitted, but we're closing in. Whoever they are, they've got deep pockets and powerful allies. This won't be easy. Danielle's voice was resolute. Nothing worth doing ever is. Back at his precinct, Larson was beginning to realize just how alone he was. He approached one of his closest allies, Officer Bradley, hoping for reassurance. They're closing in on me, Brad, Larson said, his voice tinged with desperation. You've got to back me up. Bradley looked uncomfortable. Greg, it's not just about you anymore. This thing is bigger than any of us. I've got my own family to think about. Larson's eyes widened. So that's it? You're turning your back on me? Bradley hesitated before replying. I'm saying you need to figure this out on your own. The walls are closing in, Greg. Don't drag me down with you. As Bradley walked away, Larson's anger boiled over. He punched a nearby locker, the metallic clang echoing in the empty room. The cracks in Larson's support network were becoming impossible to ignore, and Danielle knew it. We've got him cornered, Emily said, as they reviewed the latest evidence. Not yet, Danielle cautioned. Desperate people make dangerous decisions. We need to be ready for whatever Larson tries next. The unraveling of Larson's alliances was a clear sign that the corruption network was beginning to collapse. But Danielle knew the true power lay with the mysterious benefactor pulling the strings. Exposing them would require risking everything. Carter called Danielle to his office, his tone more urgent than usual. The moment she stepped inside, he slid a thick folder across the table. We have a name, Carter said, his voice low. Danielle opened the file. The first page bore the photo of a middle-aged man with a steely gaze and a perfectly tailored suit. Beneath it was the name, Edward Thorne. Thorne? Danielle repeated, scanning the details. Carter nodded. A businessman with deep political ties, a history of shadowy dealings, and enough wealth to bury anyone who challenges him. He's the benefactor Larson's network answers to. Danielle's eyes narrowed. How did we connect him to Larson? Carter leaned forward, pointing to a page of financial transactions. Through offshore accounts. Thorne has funneled money into dummy corporations that were then used to pay off victims, silence whistleblowers, and cover legal fees for officers like Larson. Danielle flipped through the documents. This is a smoking gun. Not quite, Carter cautioned. Thorne's insulated. These accounts don't directly link him to Larson. It's all through intermediaries. If we're going to bring him down, we need something solid. Then we keep digging, Danielle said firmly. That evening, Danielle drove home, her mind racing with thoughts of Thorne. The streets were quiet, her car cutting through the dim glow of streetlights. But as she turned onto a less traveled road, a pair of headlights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence. But when she made 3 consecutive turns, the car remained behind her. Danielle's grip tightened on the wheel. She slowed slightly, hoping the car would pass, but it didn't. Instead, it sped up, closing the gap between them. "All right," she muttered to herself. "Let's see what you're up to." She took a sharp left into a residential area, weaving through narrow streets. The car followed, its headlights unwavering. Danielle's heart pounded, but her focus remained sharp. She reached for her phone and dialed 911. "This is Danielle Carter. I'm being followed by a suspicious vehicle," she said quickly, giving her location. "Stay on the line," the dispatcher instructed. "Units are en route." The car behind her suddenly accelerated, pulling up alongside her. The driver, hidden behind tinted windows, swerved toward her, forcing Danielle to veer sharply to avoid a collision. "Not today," she muttered, slamming on the gas. Danielle took a hard right onto a main road, her tires screeching. The pursuing car struggled to keep up as she wove through traffic. Up ahead, the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared, and the pursuing car abruptly slowed before making a sharp U-turn. Danielle pulled over, her chest heaving as 2 officers approached her vehicle. She quickly identified herself and explained the situation. "Did you get a look at the driver?" one officer asked. "No," Danielle replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "But whoever they are, they don't want me digging any further." The next day, Danielle met with Carter to debrief. "They're getting bold," Carter said after hearing her account. "Thorne's trying to scare me off," Danielle said. "It won't work. If anything, this proves we're getting closer." Carter nodded. "Agreed, but we need to be smart. Thorne's network is vast. He has the resources to make people disappear if he feels cornered. So we hit him where it hurts," Danielle said. "His reputation, his power base. We make it clear that no one is untouchable, not even Edward Thorne." That afternoon, Danielle and Carter held a strategy session with Emily Turner. "Thorne's public image is his shield," Emily explained. "He's known as a philanthropist, a man who donates millions to charities, funds community programs, and shakes hands with senators. If we're going to expose him, we need to tear down that facade." Danielle pointed to the financial records. "These transactions are a start, but we need a direct link, something that ties him to Larson's operation without question," Carter interjected. "We're running surveillance on Thorne's known associates. One of them might lead us to something actionable." Emily nodded. "And we need to subpoena his financial institutions. If we can get access to his private accounts." "That's a big if," Carter said. "Thorne's lawyers will fight tooth and nail to keep those sealed." "Then we fight harder," Danielle said. As the team worked tirelessly to connect the dots, Carter's phone buzzed with a new lead. "Our surveillance picked up movement at one of Thorne's properties," he said, showing Danielle and Emily a photo of a secluded warehouse on the outskirts of the city. "We believe it's being used as a meeting spot for his inner circle." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Do we have enough to move in?" "Not yet," Carter admitted. "But if we can plant someone inside, we might be able to gather the evidence we need." "Let's make it happen," Danielle said. That night, Danielle returned to her apartment, her thoughts consumed by the mounting pressure of the case. As she locked her door, her phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "Last warning, walk away." Danielle stared at the screen, her resolve hardening. Whoever was behind these threats underestimated her. She forwarded the message to Carter with a simple note. "They're scared. So am I. Let's finish this." The revelation of Edward Thorne as the benefactor was a game-changer, but Danielle knew taking him down would be the most dangerous battle yet. The convoy of unmarked black SUVs rolled silently through the tree-lined road leading to Edward Thorne's sprawling estate. Inside the lead vehicle, Carter briefed his team one final time. "Thorne's security is private, well-armed, and loyal. Assume resistance the moment we breach the property. Priority is to secure him and any incriminating evidence. No mistakes," he said, his tone clipped. Danielle sat in the back seat checking her earpiece. "What about Thorne himself?" Carter glanced at her. "He'll try to talk his way out of it. Don't let him. This is a man who spent years hiding behind power and money. Make him face reality." The vehicles came to a halt a few hundred feet from the estate's front gate. Carter's voice came through the comms. "Positions. Move in." The first team approached the gate under cover of darkness, using bolt cutters to snap the heavy chain securing it. As they slipped through, floodlights suddenly flared to life, bathing the driveway in an artificial glow. A loudspeaker crackled. "This is private property. Turn around now or face the consequences." "Go loud," Carter ordered. The agents burst forward, splitting into smaller units. Shots rang out from the upper balconies of the estate as armed guards opened fire. Danielle crouched behind a stone pillar near the front entrance, her pulse racing as bullets ricocheted off the concrete. An agent beside her returned fire, forcing the guards to retreat inside. "Clear the balconies!" Carter shouted into his mic. A team of snipers moved into position, neutralizing the guards one by one. Within minutes, the gunfire from above ceased. "Move in!" Carter commanded. Danielle followed the main team as they breached the heavy oak doors, a battering ram smashing them open. The interior of the estate was a labyrinth of marble floors, grand staircases, and expensive artwork. Agents fanned out, sweeping each room methodically. "Third floor, west wing," an agent called out over the comms. Danielle and Carter rushed upstairs, their weapons drawn. At the end of the corridor, they found Edward Thorne standing in the middle of a lavish study, flanked by 2 bodyguards. Thorne raised his hands in mock surrender, a smug smile playing on his lips. "Gentlemen, and Ms. Carter," he said smoothly, "you could have just knocked." "Step away from your guards," Carter ordered, his voice firm. Thorne didn't move. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? Or what kind of mess you're about to unleash?" Danielle stepped forward. "Save the theatrics, Thorne. Your empire is crumbling, and you know it." Thorne chuckled. "My dear, you think this is about me? I'm just a facilitator, a necessary piece in a much larger puzzle." The tension in the room was electric. Danielle kept her weapon trained on him. "You've built a network that's ruined lives. You're not walking away from this." Thorne smirked, lowering his hands. "You still don't get it. Taking me down won't change a thing. The system you're so desperate to fix is rigged, and it always will be. People like me, we're untouchable." "Not tonight," Carter snapped. "Cuff him." One of the agents moved forward, slapping handcuffs onto Thorne's wrists. His bodyguards were disarmed and secured as well. As the agents began searching the study, Danielle spotted a sleek black safe behind a painting. She called over an evidence tech. "Get this open. Whatever's in there might tie everything together." Minutes later, the safe was cracked. Inside were stacks of documents, hard drives, and several passports under different names. Danielle pulled out one of the hard drives, turning it over in her hand. "This is it," she said. "The proof we need." As Thorne was escorted out of the estate, a group of journalists and camera crews had gathered outside the gates, their flashes illuminating the night. Thorne straightened his suit as best he could, maintaining his air of confidence despite the handcuffs. "Mr. Thorne, do you have any comment?" one reporter shouted. Thorne stopped, turning to face the cameras. "I have nothing to hide," he said with a practiced smile. "This is nothing more than a misunderstanding. The truth will come out." Danielle stepped out of the estate, her eyes locking with Thorne's. He smirked, leaning slightly toward her. "This isn't over, Ms. Carter," he murmured. "You've just made yourself a target." Danielle didn't flinch. "You're the one in cuffs, Thorne. The only target here is you." Thorne was pushed into the back of an FBI vehicle, the door slamming shut behind him. Back at the FBI field office, Carter and Danielle pored over the evidence seized from the raid. The documents revealed a web of financial transactions, implicating dozens of high-ranking officials, officers, and business executives. "This is bigger than we thought," Carter said, scanning the files. Danielle nodded. Thorne wasn't lying about one thing. He's part of something larger. "But that doesn't mean we stop here." Carter leaned back in his chair. "No, we don't. But now we've got their attention. They'll come after us harder than ever." Danielle's expression hardened. "Let them. We're ready." The tension in the courtroom was thick as Greg Larson took the stand. His attorney, Charles Reed, paced in front of him, building a narrative that painted Larson as the real victim. "Officer Larson," Reed began, his voice steady and measured. "This entire ordeal has been devastating for you, hasn't it?" Larson nodded, his expression one of feigned vulnerability. "It has. I've been vilified for simply doing my job. My life has been turned upside down." Reed turned to the jury, emphasizing his client's plight. "This man, a dedicated officer, has served his community for years. And now, because of baseless accusations, he's being dragged through the mud. Larson leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to the jury. I've never been anything but professional. Yes, the encounter with Ms. Carter was tense, but only because she was combative. I didn't target her. I didn't do anything wrong. Danielle sat silently at the defense table, her expression calm but focused. Emily Turner whispered beside her, "They're buying it." Danielle nodded. Not for long. When Emily rose for cross-examination, the atmosphere shifted. Her voice was sharp and deliberate. "Officer Larson," she began, "you claim you were just doing your job. Would you say issuing unwarranted citations and rough physical searches fall under the category of your duties?" Larson stiffened. "I acted within protocol." "Protocol," Emily repeated, walking toward the jury. "Let's talk about your protocol." She held up the body cam footage. "This video shows you escalating a situation with an innocent woman, making derogatory remarks, and issuing a baseless citation. Is that protocol?" Larson squirmed. "The video doesn't show the full context." Emily tilted her head. "Then let's provide some context. How about the 5 prior complaints filed against you for similar behavior? Were those just misunderstandings too?" "Objection," Reed barked. "Irrelevant." The judge shook her head. "Overruled. The jury will decide its relevance." Emily turned back to Larson. "Let's cut to the chase, Officer Larson. Isn't it true that you've repeatedly targeted individuals based on race and used your badge to shield yourself from accountability?" Larson's face reddened. "That's not true." Emily walked closer. "So you're saying all those complaints, the body cam footage, and the financial records linking you to payouts from Edward Thorne's network are just coincidences?" Larson's mouth opened, but no words came out. Emily's voice rose. "Officer Larson, isn't it true that you used your authority to intimidate and silence those who challenged you? And when you realized Ms. Carter wasn't backing down, you filed this lawsuit to deflect blame?" Larson's hands gripped the edge of the stand, his composure cracking. Yes or no, Officer Larson?" Emily pressed. Larson glanced at Reed, who avoided his gaze. I was just following orders." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Emily paused, letting the weight of Larson's words sink in before addressing the jury. "You've heard it directly from him. This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of abuse and a network that allowed it to continue unchecked. Today, you have the power to say no more." The jury was sent to deliberate, and the courtroom emptied into the hallway. Danielle stood by the water cooler, her phone buzzing incessantly with updates from Carter. "Larson's on edge," Carter said over the line. "If we push him any further, he might make a move." "Good," Danielle replied. "Let him." Later that evening, the jury returned with their verdict. The 4 persons stood, the paper trembling slightly in their hand. "In the matter of Larson versus Carter, we find in favor of the defendant, Danielle Carter." A collective exhale swept through the room. Danielle remained composed, though a flicker of relief crossed her face. Larson, on the other hand, sat frozen, his face pale, and his hands trembling. As the courtroom emptied, Larson slipped away from his lawyer and disappeared into the crowd. Danielle noticed his absence and immediately called Carter. "Larson's gone," she said. "Keep an eye on the airports." "We're already on it," Carter replied. Hours later, Larson arrived at Chicago O'Hare International Airport, a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He moved quickly through the terminal, a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country in hand. But as he approached the gate, 2 FBI agents stepped in front of him. "Greg Larson," one agent said, "you're under arrest." Larson tried to bolt, but a 3rd agent appeared from behind, grabbing his arm. "This isn't over," Larson shouted as he was cuffed. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The agents ignored him, escorting him out of the terminal as passengers and staff stared. Back at the field office, Carter briefed Danielle and Emily. "Larson tried to run, but we've got him in custody. He's panicking." "Good," Danielle said. "Let's see how long he holds out before he gives us what we need." Emily frowned. "Do you think he'll talk?" Carter leaned back. "If he doesn't, we'll make sure the evidence speaks for itself." At the FBI field office, chaos erupted as Carter's team processed Larson's arrest. The seized documents and evidence began to unravel the corruption network further. Names of officers, officials, and intermediaries surfaced, exposing a tangled web of bribery, intimidation, and cover-ups. But the network was crumbling from within. Larson's former allies, once loyal to Thorne's cause, began to turn on one another in a desperate bid to save themselves. In one interrogation room, Officer Bradley, a minor player in the network, sat across from an FBI agent, sweat beading on his brow. "It wasn't my idea," Bradley blurted. "Larson called the shots. I was just following orders." In another room, Lieutenant Miller leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Bradley's full of it," he sneered. "He was just as involved as Larson. If you want the real story, you should be looking at him." The agents documented every accusation and contradiction, using the infighting to tighten their case. Carter watched from the observation room, his arms crossed. "They're eating each other alive," Danielle said as she joined him. Carter nodded. "Desperation does that. But we still need someone higher up to flip if we want to expose the big players." "Thorne," Danielle said. "He's our best shot," Carter agreed. "But he's not breaking. Not yet." Meanwhile, outside the walls of the FBI, a different battle was brewing. The media latched onto the case, dividing public opinion. Some outlets celebrated Danielle as a crusader for justice, but others attacked her relentlessly. One headline read, "Is Danielle Carter exploiting race for personal gain?" Another commentator on a popular news channel declared, "This so-called prosecutor is tearing down good officers for her own agenda. She's part of the problem, not the solution." Danielle scrolled through the articles and comments late at night, her jaw tightening at the vitriol. Words like race baiter and opportunist jumped off the screen. Emily called as Danielle set her phone down. "Are you seeing this garbage?" "Yeah," Danielle replied. "It's predictable. They're trying to discredit you," Emily said. "It's the same playbook Thorne and Larson have been using. Don't let it get to you." "I won't," Danielle said, though the weight of it lingered. "But this isn't just about me. They're attacking the entire fight for accountability." At the same time, Thorne's legal team launched a counteroffensive, filing motions to suppress evidence and casting doubt on the integrity of the investigation. In a public statement, one of his lawyers accused the FBI and Danielle of conducting a witch hunt. Thorne himself remained calm during his appearances in court, his demeanor calculated. When reporters swarmed him outside a hearing, he smiled and said, "I have full confidence that the truth will prevail. These accusations are baseless." Danielle watched the footage from her office, frustration simmering. "He's playing the long game," Carter said, joining her. "He thinks his money and connections will shield him." "Not this time," Danielle said. "We'll make sure of it." The pressure continued to mount. Danielle faced backlash not just in the media, but from within her own circles. Some colleagues distanced themselves, wary of being associated with the case. Others outright questioned her motives. "Why are you so invested in this?" one prosecutor asked during a lunch break. "You're making enemies everywhere." "Because it's the right thing to do," Danielle shot back. "Isn't that why we became prosecutors in the first place?" "Sure," the colleague replied, shrugging. "But you're going after people with a lot of power. Be careful it doesn't backfire." Danielle bit back her frustration. "Thanks for the advice," she said curtly, walking away. As the case grew more intense, Danielle received an anonymous tip about a potential meeting between two of Thorne's associates. She and Carter coordinated a surveillance operation, hoping to gather new evidence. The meeting took place at a private club on the outskirts of the city. Danielle and a team of agents monitored from a nearby van, listening to the conversation through hidden microphones. "We need to shut this down," one of the men said. "If Thorne goes down, we all do." "Let him take the fall," the other replied. "He's too stubborn to cut a deal anyway." Danielle leaned forward, her headphones pressed tightly against her ears. "Do we have a name?" she whispered to Carter. He shook his head. "Not yet, but it's clear Thorne's losing his grip on the network." Later that night, Danielle found herself reflecting on the whirlwind of events. The attacks on her character, the growing fractures in Thorne's network, and the looming threat of retaliation weighed heavily on her. As she prepared for the next day, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're making powerful enemies. Don't think you're safe." Danielle stared at the message, her resolve hardening. She forwarded it to Carter with a single line, "Let's finish this." The warehouse loomed in the darkness, its rusted walls and broken windows hiding what lay inside. Danielle stood with Carter and a team of heavily armed FBI agents a block away, finalizing their strategy. "We have confirmation," Carter said, his voice low but resolute. "Thorne's in there, along with at least 6 of his people. They're armed and won't hesitate to fight back." Danielle checked her gear, nodding. "We take him alive. He's our key to taking down the rest of the network." Carter gave the signal, and the team moved into position, spreading out to surround the warehouse. As the agents breached the perimeter, the sound of shattering glass and splintering wood erupted. Floodlights burst to life, illuminating the area. From inside, gunfire exploded, bullets ricocheting off the metal walls. "Hostiles on the second floor!" an agent called out over the comms. Danielle ducked behind a stack of crates as the air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire. She peeked around the corner, spotting a figure firing from a balcony. Taking a breath, she aimed and fired, forcing the shooter to duck for cover. "Push forward," Carter commanded. The agents advanced methodically, returning fire as they cleared the ground floor. Danielle and Carter moved together, their weapons raised. A guard charged at them from behind a stack of pallets, but Danielle reacted instantly, dropping him with a precise shot. "Clear!" she called out. As the gunfire died down, the remaining guards surrendered, dropping their weapons and raising their hands. Carter ordered them restrained, while Danielle and a smaller team headed toward the second floor, where Thorne was believed to be hiding. They found him in an office at the back of the building, sitting behind a desk as if nothing was amiss. His suit was immaculate, his composure unshaken. "Ah, Ms. Carter," Thorne said, his voice calm and mocking. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Danielle didn't lower her weapon. "Edward Thorne, you're under arrest for corruption, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Stand up." Thorne leaned back, folding his hands. "You've been quite persistent, I'll give you that. But you're not going to like what you find. Stand up," Danielle repeated, her tone sharp. Thorne smirked, but complied, rising slowly. As Carter cuffed him, he leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Do you really think this ends with me?" Danielle stared at him, her expression unreadable. Back at the FBI field office, Thorne sat in an interrogation room, flanked by 2 agents. Danielle and Carter watched through the one-way glass, their expressions tense. "He's not going to break easily," Carter said. Danielle exhaled. "Let me try." She entered the room, placing a thick file of evidence on the table before sitting across from Thorne. "You've got nowhere to run," Danielle began. "We have your financial records, witness testimony, and communications linking you to Larson's network. It's over." Thorne chuckled, shaking his head. "You think this is over? You've barely scratched the surface." Danielle's eyes narrowed. "Then enlighten me." Thorne leaned forward, his cuffs clinking against the table. "What you're dealing with isn't just one network. It's a global system. Politicians, CEOs, law enforcement, all working together to keep people like you in line." "People like me?" Danielle repeated, her tone cutting. "Yes," Thorne said. "Idealists, do-gooders. You think exposing me will change anything? There's always someone else ready to step in." Danielle leaned in closer. "Then I'll take them down too, one by one." Thorne smirked. "Good luck. You'll need it." As Danielle left the room, Carter met her in the hallway. "Did he say anything useful?" Carter asked. "He admitted there's a bigger network," Danielle said. "But he won't give up names. Not yet." "We'll keep the pressure on," Carter said. "But he's right about one thing. This is bigger than we thought." Danielle nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we dig deeper. Thorne might be just one piece, but taking him down is still a win." Carter clapped her on the shoulder. "Agreed. Let's get to work." The weeks following Edward Thorne's arrest were a whirlwind of investigations, indictments, and systemic changes. The fallout from the case rippled through law enforcement, politics, and business. Danielle sat in a crowded press conference, watching as the police chief announced sweeping reforms. "As of today," the chief declared, his tone resolute, "we are initiating a full-scale restructuring of our department. Officers implicated in corruption are being removed from their positions, and an independent oversight committee will ensure transparency moving forward." Behind him, several officials stood grim-faced, some facing pending charges themselves. Among them was Larson. now stripped of his badge and awaiting trial for his role in the network. Carter leaned over to Danielle. They wouldn't be doing this if we hadn't forced their hand. Danielle nodded, her expression serious. It's a start, but we both know this doesn't fix everything. Carter smiled faintly. Maybe not, but it's more than we had yesterday. Later that day, Danielle joined Emily at a meeting with community leaders. The atmosphere in the room was one of cautious optimism. People are watching, said Malcolm Reed, a prominent activist. This case proved that no one is untouchable, but trust doesn't rebuild itself overnight. Danielle nodded. I understand. Accountability has to come first, and that means holding not just individuals, but the system itself responsible. Another leader, an older woman named Evelyn, leaned forward. You've shown us what's possible, Ms. Carter, but the fight doesn't end here. It never does, Danielle replied. Amid the public and professional chaos, Danielle found rare moments of quiet with her family. She spent an evening with her younger sister, Mia, in the kitchen of their childhood home, chopping vegetables while music played softly in the background. You've been on the news non-stop, Mia teased. Our neighbors keep asking if I can get them your autograph. Danielle laughed, shaking her head. I don't want to be a celebrity. I just want to do my job. Mia paused, her tone softening. You're more than just your job, you know. What you did, it's bigger than any case. Danielle looked at her sister, gratitude flickering in her eyes. Thanks, Mia. I needed that. As the reforms took shape, Danielle became an unlikely symbol of justice. Community events, interviews, and speeches filled her schedule. Despite the accolades, she kept her focus on the work. One evening, she stood on a stage at a local university, addressing a crowd of students. Justice isn't a destination, she told them. It's a constant fight, one that requires all of us to hold the powerful accountable. This isn't about me or this case. It's about building a system where truth and fairness matter more than money or influence. The applause was thunderous, but Danielle's expression remained humble. She stepped off the stage and blended into the crowd, avoiding the spotlight as much as possible. Weeks later, Danielle sat in her office, reviewing a new case file. The view of the city stretched out before her through the large window. Lights dotted the skyline, a stark reminder of the challenges still ahead. Carter knocked on her door, stepping in with a cup of coffee. Thought you could use this, he said, setting it on her desk. Thanks, Danielle replied, glancing at the file in her hand. You're already on to the next one? Carter asked, raising an eyebrow. Danielle smirked. The work doesn't stop, right? Carter chuckled. No, it doesn't. But don't forget to breathe once in a while. I'll try, Danielle said, though they both knew she wouldn't slow down anytime soon. As Carter left, Danielle set the file aside for a moment, staring out the window at the city below. The reforms were a victory, but she knew the fight against corruption and injustice would never truly be over. The familiar buzz of her phone pulled her back to the present. It was a message from a new whistleblower, ready to expose another set of injustices. Danielle exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. She reached for the file, ready to dive in. The city was far from perfect, but it was worth fighting for. Danielle's journey is a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is never easy, but it's always worth it. Through courage, resilience, and unwavering determination, she exposed corruption, demanded accountability, and sparked change in a broken system. Yet, as she learned, the work is never truly finished. What would you do if faced with the same challenges Danielle encountered? Would you stand up against injustice, even when the odds are stacked against you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found Danielle's story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shine a light on truth, resilience, and the fight for justice. Together, we can keep the conversation going.
The fluorescent lights of Greenwood's only supermarket buzzed faintly, filling the quiet afternoon with an ambient hum. It was a small town, where everyone either knew everyone else or at least claimed they did. Among the aisles stacked with cans of soup and discounted snacks, Emily Carter maneuvered her cart carefully, scanning a shopping list she'd scribbled on the back of an old receipt. She was a picture of calm, jeans, a white t-shirt, and sneakers, blending in seamlessly with the other Saturday shoppers. only a faint scar running along her left forearm, and the straight-back confidence in her stride hinted at a life beyond this mundane routine. A veteran with 22 years of military service, Emily had traded war zones for the quiet streets of Greenwood, Kentucky. She'd seen enough of the world's chaos to know how much peace the small-town life offered. Reaching for a box of cereal, Emily's attention was drawn by a sharp crash. She turned her head to see a tall, broad-shouldered man in a Greenwood Police Department uniform. He stood at the end of the aisle, holding a phone in one hand while a spilled package of macaroni and a toppled bottle of soda lay at his feet. The man barely glanced at the mess. With a shrug, he turned on his heel and began walking away. Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sheer casualness of his dismissal. Her voice, steady and firm, cut through the air. "Excuse me, sir." The man stopped, turning his head slightly but not fully facing her. He looked irritated, as though someone had interrupted something important. Emily took a step closer. "You dropped something," she said, gesturing toward the mess on the floor. He looked at her now, his face marked with annoyance. "Yes, oh." Emily's gaze didn't waver. It might not seem like a big deal, but someone could slip on that. "Why don't you clean it up?" The man straightened to his full height, towering over her by at least a foot. He glanced at the name badge pinned to his chest. "Officer Mike Johnson." "Lady, do you know who you're talking to?" he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I'm a police officer. I've got better things to do than play janitor." Emily felt a flicker of irritation, but kept her composure. She had faced men far more intimidating than Mike Johnson. "With all due respect, officer," she said evenly, "being a police officer doesn't exempt you from basic decency. Setting an example starts with small actions. Picking up after yourself is one of them." A smirk spread across Mike's face as he folded his arms. His uniform, slightly too tight around his chest and belly, seemed to stretch with the effort. "Listen, sweetheart," he began, drawing out the word with mockery. "Why don't you mind your own business? You've got no idea what it's like to wear this badge." Emily's jaw tightened, but her voice remained calm. "I know exactly what it's like to wear a uniform, Officer Johnson. 22 years in the U.S. Army taught me a lot about respect, both giving it and earning it." The smirk vanished, replaced by a glare. The two locked eyes, the tension in the aisle thickening. A couple of shoppers slowed their carts, pretending to browse, but clearly watching the exchange. Mike snorted. "Army, huh? Well, this isn't some boot camp, and you're not my drill sergeant. You don't get to boss me around here." Emily took a step closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its firmness. "I'm not trying to boss you around. I'm asking you to do the right thing. That badge on your chest, it represents responsibility. People in this town look to you for guidance. If you can't clean up after yourself in a grocery store, what does that say about the example you're setting?" Mike's face darkened, a flush creeping up his neck. He glanced around, noticing that more people had started paying attention. A teenager a few aisles down was holding up their phone, likely recording. "Is this a joke?" Mike barked, his voice rising. "You don't know anything about me, lady. You're just a washed-up vet with nothing better to do than lecture people in a supermarket." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Emily's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't back down. She took a slow breath before responding. "I don't know you, Officer Johnson," she said, her voice steady but pointed. "But I know what integrity looks like, and I'm not seeing it right now." The word struck a nerve. Mike's jaw clenched and his fists curled at his sides. "You've got some nerve," he spat. "Maybe I should write you a citation for harassment." Emily raised an eyebrow. "For asking you to clean up after yourself? Be my guest." Mike took a step closer, looming over her. His voice dropped into a low, menacing tone. "You think you're tough, huh? Some old lady playing soldier. Newsflash. Nobody cares about your glory days." Emily didn't flinch. She met his glare head-on, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't about me, and it's not about you. It's about doing what's right. If you can't handle being called out for something as simple as this, maybe you're in the wrong line of work." The crowd had grown by now, whispers and murmurs filling the air. The teenager with the phone was still recording, angling for a better shot. Mike's eyes flicked toward the growing audience, his expression a mixture of anger and discomfort. "Why don't you just walk away?" he hissed. "Because walking away from a problem doesn't solve it," Emily replied. Her voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "You might be used to people letting things slide, but not today." Mike looked like he was about to explode, but before he could say another word, a voice called out from the end of the aisle. "What's going on here?" The store manager, a wiry man with glasses and a name tag that read Tom, approached cautiously. Behind him, a couple of other employees hovered, their eyes darting between Emily and Mike. Emily turned to Tom. "There's a spill in the aisle," she said calmly. "I asked Officer Johnson to clean it up, but he seems to think he's above that." Tom's face paled as he glanced at Mike, who was now visibly fuming. We'll get someone to take care of that right away," Tom stammered. Emily shook her head. "That's not the point. This isn't about cleaning up a mess. It's about accountability." The manager hesitated, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Mike, sensing an opportunity to regain control, straightened his posture and pointed a finger at Emily. "She's causing a scene," he said sharply. "Why don't you ask her to leave?" Tom looked between them, clearly uncomfortable. Emily didn't wait for him to respond. "If holding someone accountable for their actions is causing a scene, then maybe we need more scenes like this," she said, her voice carrying across the aisle. The murmur of agreement from the crowd was faint but audible. Mike's face twisted in frustration. He opened his mouth to retort, but the sound of a phone camera clicking nearby stopped him. His eyes darted toward the teenager filming the whole exchange, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Emily, noticing his hesitation, pressed on. "You're not just a man in uniform, Officer Johnson. You're a representative of this community. And right now, the community is watching." Mike said nothing. His jaw worked as if he was trying to come up with a response. But the weight of the crowd's eyes and the camera lenses pointed at him seemed to hold him in place. The silence stretched heavy and unbroken as the tension in the aisle reached its peak. The silence lingered for a moment longer before Mike finally broke it, his voice strained with barely concealed anger. "Fine. You want me to pick it up? Is that what this is all about?" Emily didn't move, her expression calm but resolute. "It's not about the macaroni or the soda. It's about accountability, Officer Johnson. But, yes, starting with picking it up would be a step in the right direction." Mike muttered something under his breath, glancing around at the crowd. The weight of their stares was unbearable now. He bent down reluctantly, his movements stiff and jerky as he grabbed the fallen items and placed them on a nearby shelf. The soda bottle rolled slightly, and he shoved it back carelessly. "There. Happy now," he snapped, straightening up and glaring at Emily. Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she simply nodded. "Thank you." Her calm demeanor only seemed to enrage Mike further. His face was flushed, and his fists clenched at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say more, but the growing crowd and the phone still pointed at him seemed to hold him back. Instead, he turned sharply and stormed off toward the front of the store. The tension in the air didn't dissipate right away. The onlookers exchanged glances, their murmurs filling the aisle as Emily turned back to her cart. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she paid them no mind. She wasn't looking for praise or validation. She simply did what she believed was right. As she pushed her cart down the next aisle, a middle-aged woman with a kind face and a slight southern drawl stepped into her path. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up to him. That man's been throwing his weight around in this town for years." Emily offered a polite smile. "I'm just glad people saw what happened. Maybe it'll make a difference." The woman nodded, glancing over her shoulder as if checking to make sure Mike wasn't nearby. "You've got more courage than most, I'll give you that. But you be careful now, you hear? Men like him don't take kindly to being embarrassed." Emily's smile faltered slightly, but she gave a small nod. "I appreciate the concern, but I've dealt with men like him before." The woman hesitated, as though she wanted to say more, but then she simply patted Emily's arm and walked away. Emily continued her shopping, her mind replaying the confrontation in the aisle. She wasn't afraid of Mike Johnson. She'd faced men with far more power and far worse tempers during her time in the military. But the woman's words lingered in her mind. Men like him don't take kindly to being embarrassed. By the time Emily reached the checkout line, the store had settled back into its usual rhythm. The cashiers rang up items. Customers chatted idly, and the faint hum of pop music played over the speakers. Emily loaded her groceries onto the conveyor belt, trying to push the incident with Mike out of her mind. But as she swiped her credit card and gathered her bags, she noticed a figure standing by the exit. Mike Johnson leaned against the wall near the sliding glass doors, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Emily felt a flicker of irritation, but forced herself to remain calm. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her. With her bags in hand, she walked toward the exit, her steps measured and deliberate. As she approached, Mike pushed off the wall and blocked her path. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and cold. Emily raised an eyebrow. "Is there something else you'd like to say, Officer Johnson?" He glanced around, his eyes darting to the other shoppers nearby. His voice dropped even lower. "You made me look like a damn fool back there." Emily's expression didn't change. "You did that to yourself." His jaw tightened, and he took a small step closer. "You think you're some kind of hero? Calling me out in front of everyone like that?" "I think accountability matters," Emily replied evenly. "And if you're upset about how you looked, maybe you should reflect on your behavior instead of blaming me." Mike let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You don't know when to quit, do you?" Emily tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady. "No, I don't. Especially when it comes to standing up for what's right." The tension between them was palpable, and a few passers-by slowed their steps, sensing that something was amiss. Mike noticed this and straightened up, forcing a tight smile onto his face. "You're real smug for someone who doesn't know who they're dealing with." Emily didn't flinch. "And you're real arrogant for someone wearing a badge." His smile faltered, and for a moment, his eyes burned with fury. But then, just as quickly, he stepped back, raising his hand slightly in mock surrender. "Fine, have it your way, but don't think this is over." Emily watched him walk away, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, didn't call after him, didn't do anything to escalate the situation further. She simply adjusted the bags in her hands and walked out into the parking lot. The winter air was crisp as Emily loaded her groceries into the trunk of her car. She moved methodically, her mind replaying Mike's words. "Don't think this is over." She wasn't worried, not exactly, but she knew men like Mike, proud, arrogant, and deeply insecure. He wouldn't let the incident go. As she closed the trunk and moved to the driver's seat, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a message from her neighbor, Karen, who often looked after her house when she was away. "Karen, saw the video of you at the store. You okay? People are talking." Emily frowned slightly, typing a quick response. "Emily, I'm fine. What video?" Karen responded almost immediately. "Karen, someone filmed you and the cop arguing. It's all over Facebook. You're a damn local celebrity now." Emily sighed, running a hand through her short, cropped hair. That was the last thing she wanted. She wasn't looking for attention or recognition. She just wanted to live her life quietly. As she put her phone away and started the car, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Men like Mike didn't let things go, and now the whole town, and possibly more, was watching. By the time she pulled into her driveway, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across her modest suburban home. Emily carried her groceries inside, her mind still turning over the events of the day. She had just finished putting the last of the groceries away when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was an unknown number. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." A pause. Then, a familiar voice came through the line, cold and sharp. "You don't know when to stop, do you?" Emily's grip on the phone tightened. "Officer Johnson," she said, her voice calm but firm. "How did you get this number?" "That doesn't matter," he replied. "What matters is that you think you can humiliate me and get away with it." Emily's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone even. "This is harassment, Officer Johnson. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." There was another pause, longer this time. Then in a low, threatening tone, he said, "This isn't over." The line went dead. Emily lowered the phone slowly, her heart steady but her mind racing. She set the phone down on the counter and took a deep breath, her years of military training kicking in. She didn't know what Mike Johnson's next move would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't about to back down. Emily sat at her kitchen table, staring at the remnants of her dinner. A half-eaten sandwich and a cold cup of tea sat untouched, her appetite dulled by the events of the day. The phone call from Officer Mike Johnson had left her unsettled, not because she feared him, but because she knew men like him, men who wielded power like a weapon, who lashed out when their authority was questioned. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Outside, the streetlights buzzed, casting a dim glow over her driveway. She reached for her phone and scrolled through her notifications. Karen had sent her the link to the video. Against her better judgment, Emily clicked on it. The footage was shaky but clear enough. It captured the moment she confronted Mike in the aisle, her calm, steady voice cutting through his defensive arrogance. The comments below the video were a mix of praise and criticism. Good for her. Someone needs to hold cops accountable. This lady has guts. Respect. She's just looking for attention. Leave the man alone. Another hero trying to go viral. Emily sighed and closed the app. She hadn't asked for any of this. She just wanted to buy her groceries and go home, not become the center of an online debate. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Emily froze for a moment, her instincts kicking in. It was late, too late for a casual visit. She stood and moved toward the door, her footsteps silent on the hardwood floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw two uniformed officers standing on her porch. She unlocked the door and opened it cautiously. "Can I help you?" The older of the two officers, a stocky man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "Ms. Carter?" "Yes," she replied, her tone wary. "I'm Sergeant Bill Hayes." "This is Officer Lopez," he said, gesturing to the younger officer beside him. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about an incident that occurred earlier today at the supermarket." Emily's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Is that so?" Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "Mind if we come in?" Emily hesitated. Letting officers into her home, especially under these circumstances, didn't sit right with her. But refusing them could escalate things unnecessarily. She stepped aside and motioned for them to enter. The two officers stepped inside, their boots heavy against the floor. Emily gestured toward the living room. "Take a seat." They sat on her couch, while Emily remained standing, crossing her arms over her chest. "What's this about?" Hayes cleared his throat. "We received a complaint from Officer Mike Johnson regarding your behavior at the market." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "My behavior? He claims you were aggressive and disruptive." Hayes continued. "He also mentioned that you made threats against him." Emily let out a dry laugh, shaking her head. "That's not what happened." Hayes raised a hand. "We're just here to gather information, ma'am. Can you tell us your version of events?" Emily took a deep breath and recounted the confrontation in the aisle, her tone measured and factual. She left nothing out, from Mike's refusal to pick up the mess to his condescending remarks. When she finished, Hayes nodded slowly. And the phone call you received later? Did you recognize the voice? Emily's expression hardened. It was Mike Johnson. He made it very clear this wasn't over. Lopez, who had been silent until now, glanced at Hayes. If that's true, that's a serious accusation, Sarge. Hayes rubbed his chin, looking thoughtful. Ms. Carter, do you have any proof of the phone call? Emily shook her head. No, but I know it was him. Hayes leaned back on the couch, his eyes scanning her face. Look, ma'am, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but this is a small town. Mike's been with the department for years. He's not exactly a model officer, but he's got connections. Emily's jaw tightened. So, what are you saying? That nothing will be done because he's connected? I'm saying this could get messy, Hayes replied, his tone cautious. If you push this, he'll push back harder. And guys like Mike don't play fair. Emily uncrossed her arms and leaned forward slightly. Sergeant Hayes, with all due respect, I've dealt with men like Mike in war zones. I'm not afraid of him. Hayes studied her for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. We'll file a report about the phone call. And if you get any more unwanted attention, call us immediately. Emily nodded, though she wasn't entirely reassured. Thank you. The two officers stood, and Hayes extended a hand. Take care, Miss Carter. And watch your back. Emily shook his hand, then saw them out. As the door closed behind them, she locked it and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. The next morning, Emily woke to find her phone buzzing with notifications. She groaned, rubbing her eyes as she reached for it. The video from the supermarket had gone viral, now being shared on major platforms. News outlets were picking it up, and her name was everywhere. Her phone rang, and she saw Karen's name on the screen. Morning, Karen, Emily said, her voice still groggy. Emily, you've officially broken the internet, Karen said with a laugh. You're all over the news. They're calling you a hero. Emily sighed. I didn't do anything heroic. I told a man to clean up after himself. Well, apparently that's enough these days, Karen said. But listen, I'm calling to warn you. Mike's not taking this well. My brother works with the police department, and he says Mike's been ranting about you nonstop. He's furious. Emily sat up, her expression hardening. Is that so? Yeah, Karen said, her tone nervous. Just be careful, okay? I will, Emily promised, though her mind was already turning over her next steps. She wasn't going to let Mike intimidate her, but she also wasn't naive. Men like him thrived on fear and control, and she knew he wouldn't stop unless someone held him accountable. As she got dressed and prepared for the day, Emily made a decision. She wasn't going to wait for Mike's next move. If he wanted a fight, she would face him head-on but on her terms. Her first stop was the mayor's office. Mayor James Walker was a tall, thin man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. He'd served Greenwood for over a decade and was known for his tough stance on corruption. Emily sat across from him in his modest office, recounting everything that had happened, from the supermarket incident to the phone call. Walker listened intently, his hands folded on the desk. When she finished, he let out a long sigh. This isn't the first complaint I've received about Mike Johnson, he admitted. Then why is he still on the force? Emily asked bluntly. Walker frowned. Small-town politics, Miss Carter. People look the other way. But now, with this video circulating, my hands are tied. I can't ignore it anymore. Good, Emily said, because I'm not backing down, and neither should you. Walker gave her a small, approving nod. I admire your courage. I'll open an investigation into his conduct, but I'll need your cooperation. You'll have it, Emily said firmly. As she left the mayor's office, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Mike Johnson had underestimated her, but he was about to learn a hard lesson. Emily Carter wasn't the kind of woman who backed down from a fight. Emily Carter had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but as she drove back home from the mayor's office, A storm of thoughts swirled in her mind. She had set the wheels in motion for something bigger than she had anticipated. What had started as a simple confrontation over spilled macaroni and soda had now escalated into an investigation that could rock Greenwood's police department. She parked her car in the driveway and sat for a moment, staring at the dashboard. There was a part of her, a small, nagging voice, that questioned if she'd done the right thing. Not for herself, but for the town. Greenwood was small, and people didn't like rocking the boat. Exposing someone like Mike Johnson could uncover things no one wanted to deal with. But as quickly as the doubt came, she silenced it. This wasn't just about her. It was about accountability, justice, and respect, values she had spent her entire military career fighting to uphold. As she stepped into her house, the quiet felt heavier than usual. The tension of the past few days had seeped into the walls, and for the first time, Emily allowed herself to acknowledge that she was tired. Tired of always having to be the one to stand up. Tired of people like Mike Johnson who abused their positions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Karen again. "Karen," Emily said as she answered, "if this is about another article or post, It's not that," Karen interrupted, her voice frantic. "Emily, I think you need to come over here. Now." "What's going on?" Emily asked, her voice sharp with concern. "It's Mike," Karen said. "He's been driving up and down our street, real slow. And he parked outside your house for a few minutes before leaving." Emily's hand gripped the phone tighter. "Did you see which way he went?" "Back toward downtown, I think," Karen replied. "Emily, I don't like this. He's not acting right." "Thanks for letting me know," Emily said. "Stay inside, Karen. Lock your doors." After hanging up, Emily's first instinct was to call the police. But who would she call? Half the department probably had Mike's back, and the other half would be too scared to get involved. No, this was something she would handle herself, for now. The next day, Emily decided it was time to gather more support. She reached out to a few community members she trusted, local business owners, church leaders, and even a retired police captain named David Miller. David had served as Greenwood's police chief for 20 years before retiring a few years ago. He had a reputation for being fair, honest, and fiercely protective of the town's integrity. "I saw the video," David said when Emily met him at the local diner. "It doesn't surprise me. Mike Johnson's been a problem for years. Why wasn't anything done about him?" Emily asked, sipping her coffee. David leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "Politics, mostly. His uncle is on the city council, and his family's been in Greenwood for generations. He's untouchable, or at least he was." Emily set her cup down. "The mayor said he's opening an investigation. But I'm not naive, David. I know how these things can get buried." David nodded. "They'll try to bury it, especially if Mike starts dragging other people down with him. But if you keep the pressure on, they won't have a choice. The public's on your side right now. Use that." Emily appreciated David's candor, but she could see the concern in his eyes. He wasn't just worried about the investigation. He was worried about her. "You think he'll come after me?" she asked. David hesitated before answering. "Mike's a bully. He thrives on intimidation. But bullies get dangerous when they feel cornered." Emily gave a small nod. "Then it's a good thing I'm not easy to intimidate." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily sat on her porch with a cup of tea. The quiet hum of crickets filled the air, but her mind was anything but quiet. She kept thinking about Karen's call, about Mike's threats, and about what David had said. Her phone buzzed on the small table beside her. She picked it up and saw a text from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake. Walk away while you still can." Emily stared at the screen, her pulse steady, but her grip tightening around the phone. She didn't need to guess who it was. The message was vague enough to avoid being incriminating, but the intent was clear. She set the phone down and took a slow sip of tea, her eyes scanning the dark street in front of her house. If Mike thought he could scare her into silence, he was sorely mistaken. The next day, Emily decided to push harder. She scheduled a meeting with Mayor Walker and brought David Miller along for support. The mayor's office was small and cluttered, with papers and files stacked haphazardly on every surface. "Ms. Carter," Walker said as they sat down, "I understand your concerns, but I want you to know that the investigation is underway. These things take time." "Time is fine," Emily replied, her tone firm. "But transparency is critical. The people of Greenwood need to know that their leaders are taking this seriously." Walker sighed, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand the kind of pressure we're under. Mike's family doesn't run this town," David interrupted, his voice sharp. "The people do, and the people are watching." Walker glanced between them, clearly feeling the weight of their words. Finally, he nodded. "You're right. I'll hold a public forum. We'll update the community on the investigation and hear their concerns." "That's a start," Emily said. "But don't let this turn into another empty gesture. The people of Greenwood deserve better." Walker nodded again, though the doubt in his eyes was clear. That night, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that things were coming to a head. The tension in the town was palpable. People were talking about Mike, about the video, about the investigation. Lines were being drawn, and sides were being chosen. She stayed up late, going through old military files she kept in a box in her closet. Among them were commendations, letters of thanks, and even a few reprimands for stepping out of line to defend her values. One letter caught her eye, a note from a former commander that read, "Your integrity is both your greatest strength and your greatest vulnerability. Never lose it, but know that it will make you enemies." She folded the letter and placed it back in the box. Those words had proven true more times than she could count, and now they felt more relevant than ever. The next morning, as Emily walked to her mailbox, she noticed a black SUV parked a few houses down. The windows were tinted and the engine idled softly. She paused, her instincts kicking in. The SUV didn't belong to anyone on her street. Emily turned and walked back to her porch, her movements deliberate. She pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the vehicle. As she did, the SUV pulled away, disappearing down the street. Her jaw tightened. Mike was getting bolder. She walked back inside and locked the door behind her. It was clear now, this wasn't just about holding him accountable. This was about standing her ground in the face of intimidation. And Emily Carter wasn't about to back down. The Greenwood Community Center was packed. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the room, every seat occupied. The walls buzzed with murmurs and hushed conversations as residents waited for the start of the public forum. It had been years since the town had seen this level of turnout for anything, let alone a meeting to address misconduct by one of its own police officers. Emily Carter sat near the front, her posture as straight as ever, hands resting calmly in her lap. Beside her was David Miller, the retired police chief who had been one of her strongest allies throughout this ordeal. Karen was a few rows behind, giving her a reassuring thumbs up. The tension in the air was palpable, but Emily was steady. She had faced far greater battles than this. At the front of the room, Mayor James Walker adjusted the microphone, his usual air of confidence tempered by the weight of the moment. To his right sat Chief of Police Henry Turner, his expression grim, and to his left, the man who had brought the town to this point, Officer Mike Johnson. Mike was in full uniform, sitting stiffly with his arms crossed. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes darted toward the audience, as if daring anyone to challenge him. The bruised ego was written all over his face, but beneath it, Emily could see the simmering anger. The mayor tapped the microphone, bringing the room to attention. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight's forum is an opportunity for us to address the concerns raised about Officer Johnson's conduct and to hear directly from the community." He hesitated for a moment, scanning the crowd. "I want to assure you that we are taking this matter seriously. An investigation is underway, and we are committed to transparency." A hand shot up in the middle of the room. It belonged to a middle-aged man with a baseball cap, and a work shirt bearing the name of a local auto shop. "Mayor Walker," he called out, "what's the point of an investigation if nothing ever changes? We've all seen the video. We've all heard the stories. How many chances does Johnson get?" A ripple of murmured agreement swept through the room. The mayor glanced at Chief Turner, who leaned forward to speak. "I understand your frustration," Turner began, his voice calm but firm. "Officer Johnson's actions in the video do not reflect the values of this department. That's why we've opened a formal investigation and placed him on administrative leave." The words hung in the air for a moment before another voice called out, this time from the back of the room. "Administrative leave? That's just a paid vacation. What about accountability?" The room erupted into chatter, voices overlapping as more people shouted their grievances. Emily remained silent, her eyes fixed on Mike. He was staring at the table in front of him, his hands gripping the edges tightly. Mayor Walker raised his hands for silence. "Please, everyone, one at a time. Let's keep this constructive." At that moment, Emily stood. The room quieted almost immediately, all eyes turning to her. "My name is Emily Carter," she began, her voice steady but commanding. "I'm the woman in the video, and I'd like to say a few words." The mayor gestured for her to continue. Emily took a deep breath and turned to face the audience. What happened in that supermarket wasn't just about spilled macaroni or disrespect. It was about something much bigger, something that affects all of us. Accountability. She turned toward Mike now, her gaze unwavering. Officer Johnson represents more than just himself. He represents the Greenwood Police Department. When someone in uniform abuses their position, whether it's through arrogance, intimidation, or neglect of duty, it erodes trust. And without trust, there can be no community. The room was silent, every word sinking in. Emily stepped closer to the front, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't come here tonight to humiliate anyone or to drag anyone's name through the mud. But I also didn't come here to let this slide. Because if we let this slide, what message are we sending? That it's okay to abuse power? That it's okay to intimidate and disrespect the very people you're supposed to serve?" She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "I spent 22 years in the Army. I know what it means to wear a uniform. I know the weight of that responsibility. And I know how easy it is to forget that the uniform isn't what earns respect. It's your actions." The room erupted into applause, and even the mayor looked moved. Emily turned back to Mike, who was now glaring at her with barely concealed rage. "You told me this wasn't over," she said, her voice low but firm, meant for him and him alone. "You were right. It's not over, because this town deserves better." Mike stood suddenly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I've had enough of this," he barked, his voice echoing through the room. "This whole thing is a damn witch hunt." Chief Turner's face darkened. "Officer Johnson, sit down." "No," Mike snapped, pointing a finger at Emily. "This is her fault. She's the one stirring up trouble, making me out to be the bad guy." Emily didn't flinch. She met his anger with an unshakable calm. "This isn't about me," she said simply. "It's about you, and the choices you made." The room buzzed with tension as Chief Turner stood. "That's enough, Officer Johnson. Effective immediately. You're suspended without pay pending the outcome of this investigation." The words hit Mike like a punch. His face twisted in fury, and for a moment, Emily thought he might lash out. But instead, he grabbed his hat off the table and stormed out of the room, shoving a chair out of his way as he went. The door slammed behind him, and the room was silent once more. In the days that followed, the investigation into Mike Johnson's conduct expanded. Other complaints surfaced, some recent, some years old, all painting a picture of a man who had long abused his power without consequence. The mayor and Chief Turner held true to their promise of transparency, keeping the community informed every step of the way. When the investigation concluded, Mike was officially fired from the Greenwood Police Department. The town, though shaken by the ordeal, began to heal. Training programs were implemented for the police force. focusing on accountability, community engagement, and de-escalation. The changes didn't happen overnight, but they happened. As for Emily, she returned to her quiet life. Though her role in the town's transformation didn't go unnoticed, people stopped her in the street to thank her, to share their own stories of standing up against injustice. One evening, as she sat on her porch with a cup of tea, Karen joined her, a smile on her face. "You know you're a hero to a lot of people, right?" Karen said, settling into the chair beside her. "I'm no hero," Emily replied, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I just did what needed to be done." Karen shook her head. "Well, hero or not, you made a difference. This town's better because of you." Emily didn't respond right away. She sipped her tea, letting the quiet of the evening settle around them. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice thoughtful, "but it's not about me. It's about all of us. Doing what's right, even when it's hard." Karen smiled. "Well, I'd say you set a pretty good example." Emily looked out at the darkening sky, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't one for recognition, but deep down, she knew Karen was right. And for the first time in a long while, Emily Carter felt at peace.